My name is Kelly Brown Douglas, and I currently serve as Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York, as well as Canon Theologian of the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Being a theologian was not one of those things that when you're growing up you say, oh, I want to be a theologian when I grow up. Because quite frankly, I had never heard of theology, let alone that there was someone who could actually do that for a living and call themselves a theologian. I must say that I had not really heard of theology until I was in college. I went to Denison University, which is a university in Granville, Ohio, right outside of Columbus, Ohio. Most people have heard of Columbus, not Granville. And so while at Denison, indeed when I was a junior in college there at Denison, I was, as happens in college, you grow into clearer understanding of who you are as a person. For me, who I am as a Black person, as a Black woman, and as is always the case, and during my time in college, there were particular incidents dealing with racial injustice, racial discrimination, and of course the United States, as globally, is the reality of racism is prevalent. And so during my junior year of college, I was very clear, because I loved church. I'm an Anglican and Episcopalian in the United States, but an Anglican, and I was very clear that if the church and if Christianity had nothing to say about the Black struggles in our country and had nothing to say about what it meant for me and anyone else to be a Black person navigating the realities of white racism, then I was more than ready to leave Christianity behind, because I wasn't going to betray my Blackness. I wasn't going to leave my Blackness behind. And so that was a time for me, you look back, I call it a time of existential sort of crisis. But it was a time of crisis. It was a crisis of faith, if you will, because I could not understand the relationship between Christianity and what it meant for me to be Black. And right about that time, a professor who was then dean of the chapel at Denison, with whom I was good friends, David Woodyard, handed me a book, and he said, read this book. The book was James Cone's A Black Theology of Liberation. I had never heard of theology, so of course I had never heard of James Cone. And for whatever reason, I went home for the weekend. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, so it was about an hour or so from my college. And I read that book twice over that weekend. And the reason I read it twice was the first time I read it in James Cone's book, Black Theology of Liberation. He's talking about God is Black, whiteness is of the Antichrist. And I'm like, oh, something's either wrong with this book or the man who gave it to me, because the man who gave it to me was white. So I read it again for a second time, and that was my answer. And I knew that I needed to go study with this man who had written that book. And that was my introduction to theology. And from then on, I developed a passion for theology, because what he was doing in that book was introducing me again to my forebears' faith. He was introducing me to Christianity. And I then knew that not only could I be Black and Christian, but to be Christian was to be Black. And so that was my introduction to theology, and that was why I became a theologian. To study with James Cone, I studied with James Cone, of course. As I said, he's what brought me to seminary. And so when I entered Union Theological Seminary, my intention was only to do the Masters of Divinity there and go on. I was a psych major, and go on and do work in psychology. And my young, arrogant 22-year-old self said, I'm going to take these principles of a black theology of liberation and apply it to psychology and have a black psychology, as if there wasn't already a black psychology. But James Cone, when I went there, one of the things that ignited my passion for theology was that he said to me, and throughout my work with him, he said, he had a real high voice, which is, one would think of this low, deep voice for the way in which he was so passionate in terms of his theology. But he said, Kelly, that voice. He said, you find your voice. And throughout my time with him, you find your voice. He said, you are a black woman. I am a black man doing this theology. He said, you do theology from what it means for you to be a black woman. The other thing that James Cone did not tolerate was mediocrity. As I said, he didn't suffer fools lightly. So he wanted me to find my voice and to be the best, and the best that I could be, because he always made clear that our ancestors fought for you to be here. So no, you gotta take this self stuff seriously. And he said that theology, and this was what really, even more made me passionate about theology. And one thing that James Cone was clear about, he was clear that theology wasn't a luxury enterprise, shouldn't be just an academic enterprise. He said, black people are dying. He said, and we have to have something to say about that. And we have to do something about that. And so to work with James Cone was to work with the man of those books. He was very passionate about black excellence. He was very passionate and committed to the black struggle for freedom. And he didn't care where he was or who he was talking to. He was not going to allow for white people to get away with their implicit or explicit or whatever kind of racism. And he fought for his black students, and he certainly fought for the black people who were on the underside of racial injustice. The other thing that was important and significant about James Cone, when I first came through, I entered Union Theological Seminary in 1979 and to do an MDiv, and then 3 years later stayed on to do a PhD. There was absolutely no place, really, in theological education that a black person, a person of color, could go and do PhD work, writing from out of their own experience and doing work around issues that mattered to them. James Cone accepted for a long time there, and maybe quite up until the end, he only accepted black students or students of color because he said white people could go anywhere they wanted to go. And we couldn't do that. He accepted black students and he allowed us to do the work that mattered to us. And so he and I remained, he was my mentor. We remained very good friends right up until his death. I was able to spend that last year with him and even the last week of his life with him. And he was the person, my first book, The Black Christ, was published with Orbis, whom I've been with now for over 30 years, but it was James Cone who introduced my work to Orbis, to Robert Ellsberg. It was James Cone who brought me into the Ecumenical Association of Theologians. And so I feel that as I can continue in the work that I do as a theologian, as a professor, that my job is not, as Cone would say, I don't want other Cones, you find your voice. My job is to also help and create a path and opening for those other voices, other black theological voices, women, men, LGBTQ persons, and other persons of color, so that they can find their theological voice and use it to change and transform the world and the church. Yeah, the questions that caused me and prompted me to write The Black Christ. As I answer that, let me say that I really do believe, as Anselm said, that theology is about faith seeking understanding. And so for each book, it was me trying to understand my faith in particular contexts of struggle. And so in this regard, The Black Christ was a book that I wrote really trying to understand more about my grandmother's faith. My maternal grandmother was a very faithful person. She came up from the U.S. South, made her way to the North during the time of the Great Migrations, when many Black people were moving from the South to the North and other parts of the country, looking for freedom and trying to find a way to just live and survive while Black. She was one of those persons. And one thing that I always remember about my grandmother, she prayed every night, read her Bible, would sit on the front porch of her house with a cup of coffee at the end of the day and a bowl of rice, because she loved rice, reading her Bible. And I wanted to know more about my grandmother's faith. And that's what led me to write The Black Christ. And it was a search into understanding what really did it mean for Christ to be Black. Did that have any relevance? And you know, my grandmother wouldn't have talked about the Black Christ. She was of that generation of grandmothers that would have these images of the white Christ with leading a little lamb in her house. So she would, so like, does the Black Christ say anything to my grandmother's faith? And so that's what led me to write that book, really, to understand more of what these theologians meant when they said the Black Christ, and to really try to understand if it really had anything to say to someone like my grandmother, and if it really was about the faith of our enslaved forebears and those who would come after them. And I discovered that it was. Yes, that's a good question, because I did in that book talk a lot about, this was my first book, and clearly that book emerged out of my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. So I spent a lot of time talking about with various Black theologians what they meant by the Blackness of Christ, even as I tried to understand that more. What I said then and what I've developed and am even more committed to now, I believe then, was, first of all, it is historically inaccurate to have any images or to talk about Christ as if Christ is white. You know, these images of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus are historically incorrect. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, and that means that Jesus looked more like me than he did some blonde-haired, blue-eyed white person who typically portrays Jesus in films, etc., or any of the iconography, of religious iconography as it reflects Jesus. So that's the first thing. It is historically incorrect to portray Jesus as anything other than a Palestinian Jew, which means more of a person of color. The second thing that I think and say is that not only is it historically incorrect, it is theologically incorrect to suggest that Jesus is anything other than black in the context out of which black people find themselves subjected to the realities of anti-black white supremacy, which puts them on the underside of justice. Why is it theologically incorrect to suggest that Jesus is anything other than black? Because the fact that Jesus was crucified indicates Jesus' utter, uncompromising solidarity with those on the underside of justice, with those who are trapped in crucifying realities, with those, as theologian Howard Thurman would say, the disinherited, those with their backs against a wall or no wall upon which to have their back. So theologically, one must affirm that Jesus was black because Jesus was in utter solidarity with the oppressed. And in the context of anti-black white supremacy, Jesus is black. So that's what I believe. The Black Christ is a Christian confession of faith if indeed we are to take seriously the fact that the core of our faith is a crucified Savior. Oh, right. Asking a favorite book is like asking for the favorite child, right? Unfortunately, I only have one child, so that's always an easy question for me to answer. You know, each of those books are different and written at a different stage of my own journey, my own theological and faith journey of trying to figure out the meaning of my faith. So I'll talk about two. One is sexuality and the Black church. And I wrote that book during the time of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States. So early 90s I wrote it, and that crisis came to a sort of crisis point in the mid to late 80s. But I had a very, very, very close friend whom we were so close we called each other cousins, and I named him, he was my son's godfather. He happened to be gay, a gay man, and he loved his church, but his church didn't love him back. And that was unfortunately too much of the reality, particularly in the Black faith community. He eventually died from complications of AIDS. His name was Lloyd. And I said, you know what? Again, I found myself at a point of crisis. I cannot be a part of a church that can't love Lloyd. And so I had to figure out, and I went on a search to understand why there was such a passionate homophobia, as we often termed it at that time, within the Black faith community. And so I went to, find an answer to that, and I was very clear that it is not LGBTQ realities of sexuality that are sinful. It is anti-LGBTQ sentiments and phobia and what I now call terrorism that is sinful. So that book became very meaningful to me. And ironically, you write these things they're your own search. And, I write these books in the quiet of my home office or wherever I'm writing. And I don't write them because I think, I want them to make this impact. I want people to read them. I don't know if people are going to read them or not. It always amazes me when they do. But one of the reasons that book continues to have meaning to me is that I've rarely been to a place where somebody, Black, and even young Black people continue to come up to me and say, that book saved me, and because it allowed me to know that nothing was wrong with me. So that's one book. The other book that Stand Your Ground was a shift in what I did, but I have to say now my most recent book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, is one that has much meaning to me and probably my favorite because it's a book I did essentially from dialogues that I had with my young adult son. that took place over a 7-year span, those dialogues, from when he was 22 to like 29. And as he raised questions of, and I'll speak about it a little later in this conference that I'm attending here in Warwick, where he asked the question, you know, will there ever be a future? Do you ever really believe that Black lives will matter? And he asked me, because he knows my work, he said, I get it, that God is Black and that Jesus is Black, but what use is that doing for us now? And so this was a book that I wrote on the edge of despair, really asking myself, okay, God, if you're supposed to be so just, what's up with this? When are Black lives gonna matter in this nation? And I wrote it during the time of the COVID pandemic coming together with the pandemic of anti-Black white supremacy and rearing its head in a most vicious way again during the, right after the murder of George Floyd and other successive murders. And so that book came out of a time of angst and existential despair, but it becomes my favorite because I call it my book and my son's name is Desmond. I always say to Desmond, that's our book, because it were his questions that prompted that book. And so each chapter of that book is framed by the questions that he has asked me or the conversations we've had over a 7-year period. Well, see, now that's a question for people in the UK, Black people and people of the African diaspora in the UK. But from my perspective, and I think there's one great indices, not, and then I'll say a little more. No, it's a different reality, but or as my son said just to me last night, the night before this interview that I'm having, my son said it's a different horse, but the same old trick. And so, no, it's not different because there is a global consistency of anti-Black white supremacy. And one of the reasons that we know this is that what happened when in the United States George Floyd was murdered, or he was lynched, a 21st century version of being lynched in the street, a spectacle lynching, when George Floyd was lynched and the Black Lives Matter protests erupted again in the United States, they erupted globally. Right? And there were no greater protests than there were here in the UK, in London and in Liverpool, where they protested in front of City Hall. I mean, come on, Liverpool is like the second leg of the slave triangle. And so where they erupted, and they were erupting globally from people in the African diaspora, not, yes, in support of what was going on in the United States, but what was going on in the United States was a catalyst for other Black people across the globe to say, Black Lives Matter here, and began to talk about, it was amazing, the same kind of police brutality. I think here in the UK, they talk about stop and strip. We talked about stop and search. Here, I just read a report that was given from by the UN about racism and anti-Blackness. They called it anti-Afro Blackness or something in the UK. I was thinking I was reading a report on the United States where it talked about the way in which systemic, and structural anti-Black white racism functions in the UK, where they interviewed people who talked about the police brutality. As one young teenager said, you know, he was stopped and the police said to him, accused him of playing the race card. Your former former prime minister, 2 prime ministers back now, but Boris Johnson under his government issued a report that essentially denied the reality of racism and white supremacy in this country. We had one of those presidents at the same time that you all had Boris Johnson as prime minister, and deny as people in the African diaspora here, Black Brits, have talked about the way in which history has been sanitized in this country so that you aren't talking about the colonialism and racism and slavery. Well, in our country, there's a whole big movement. You can't even talk about race. They tried to talk about, had a curriculum that talked about Rosa Parks, you know, the woman that began in some respects the bus boycott, and they wanted to talk about Rosa Parks without even mentioning race. How do you do that? So I guess I just answered that question by saying it's a different horse, but the same old trick. And it is amazing the consistency of whiteness and anti-blackness across the daggone globe. And I'll just end by saying this. This is why there is this movement of Afro-pessimism, in which the Afro-pessimists indeed say that anti-blackness is so ingrained within the very framework of of Western thought and of Western systems and structures that we will never be able to rid ourselves of it. So we need to begin to figure out how to navigate it, live within it, and still be free. And so, to your question, yep, it's the same. Yeah, and race does matter in theology. And, you know, for those who are in training for ministry and those who have been in ministry for a long time, the first thing, you know, that we must understand is that the only way in which structures of oppressive power, and hence anti-black white racism, can continue to exist is that they are legitimated by theological and religious, if you will, canopies that allow people to think that the way things are is the way they're supposed to be, the way God has created them to be. We know that unjust power, as philosopher Michel Foucault said, has a will to knowledge. It creates the knowledge it needs to sustain itself. And there is no greater knowledge than theological or religious knowledge, because then you're connecting it to something like that transcendent, and oh, this is the way God created it to be. That's the first thing people need to say. So that we must take seriously the role that religion and theology has played in sustaining racism across the globe. That's the first thing. Christianity, because it has become the religion of power in so many respects, though not the majority religion across the globe, but the religion of power, Christianity is particularly implicated, right? Especially in a place like the UK, that, you know, went around the world colonizing, and so that it has become Christianity is particularly implicated, which means that Christianity, first of all, within its very infrastructure, is anti-black white racism is embedded in the theological infrastructure of Christianity. I won't go into detail about that. But what leads me to say is that then those who would call themselves, particularly Christian theologians or ministers and conduct ministry in the Christian church, have a particular responsibility to not only tell the truth about that religion, but to also act in a way that reveals that there is really a crucified Savior at the center of the faith. I always say, you know what, if you're Christian, then you need to act like it, because at the center of our faith tradition is someone that died on the cross. And Jesus didn't get on the cross because he prayed too much. Jesus was crucified because he stood over and against all that will oppress and keep one from reaching this just future where all would be able to live into the fullness of who they were, and all would be able to enjoy freedom and enjoy justice. He fought against that, and he did that not from the vantage point of those in power, but from the powerless, right? From the crucified classes. That, if we really want to call ourselves Christian, if we really believe in this Savior who was crucified on the cross, then instead of just wearing these empty crosses around our neck, we need to truly pick up the cross and follow the one that we claim to believe in, which means to, as I say, partner with God and moving us toward a more just future. So our theological seminaries and those who are preparing for ministry, and those of us who prepare people for ministry, and those who are in ministry, if they are indeed in a ministry that they claim to be a Christian ministry, then must always hold themselves accountable not to present realities, but accountable to the just future that God calls us to, and their ministry should be never any less than transformative and transforming, and that means that their ministries cannot, if they are truly Christian ministries, then they can never not speak to and against anti-black, white racism in the context in which they find themselves. And we got to prepare people to do that.
I'm delighted that the St. John's Timeline has now found a new home. We are working with the Christian publisher Hymns A&M, and the new website hosts all the videos we have produced over the last 12 years, including plenty of new material. There is over 160 videos, 100 hours of quality content, which we are known for. There is a low annual subscription fee, and all the profits will be going to produce new videos. The link to stjohnstimeline.org is in the video description below.